What's up, everybody? It's Paul from Boosted Films, and today we're going to do a teardown of an EVO 8 cylinder head. And this is not a how-to video, this is not instructional, this is more of me documenting what I've done. This is something that I hope can be useful for someone if they're looking for parts or if they are just generally curious about how something works, that they could utilize this, maybe just to be entertained. Whatever. But if you're working on your cylinder head, you're probably bringing it to a machine shop to have them do a lot of this, but hopefully this can help you be more informed and give you some other helpful tips along the way. Also, there are some very smart people on the internet, and I do actually say that without sarcasm. So if you want to check comments, other people might have good information as well, maybe things I missed or maybe things I did wrong. So as always, I encourage you to check the comments, check other sources as well before you really decide on what you're going to do with your car's engine. So let's just jump right into it. This is my USDM EVO 8 cylinder head. It has 210,000 miles on it, and it was still technically working. It was just on an engine that had crank walk. So we're going to cover some basic components of the head. I'm going to show you taking it apart. I'm going to show you other little things that I found out that I think are worth mentioning to look for, and hopefully a couple cool things to check out as well. So first, I just wanted to show you a bit of what it looks like when it's disassembled, show you the intake ports, the exhaust ports, show you what things look like. So we're just spinning the head around initially, giving you some different angles and what this head looked like when I first took it apart. And next, just because I thought it looked kind of cool and it was interesting to visualize, I'm putting some basically parts washer solution like through where the turbo oil feed line goes, and then you can see where this oiling system is kind of interconnected, where these where the camshaft sits, where the fluid's coming through, that's where your oiling would go through. So I just thought that looked kind of neat. And of course, that's the important stuff that you need to get cleaned, especially if you had any type of metal debris, if you had a spun bearing or anything odd, that's the stuff you need to watch out for. Make sure it gets cleaned before you are putting anything back together. So just a quick look at some of the components once they're outside of the head and cleaned up a little bit here. We have our valves. I believe the exhaust valves are sodium-filled valves, even just on the EVO 8. I don't think the intake actually are. We also have the valve springs with their retainers. And then the little smaller shims, basically, as I like to call them, those thin little pieces as well, go underneath the springs. I like to call them shims, but if you're looking at the owner's manual, they're going to call them a valve spring seat. Next up is just a shot of the valve spring seals. These will go basically underneath the springs, and they sit on top of your valve guides. And then we have some keepers, also known as locks, here as well. These are new GSC keepers and locks that I put in. And something else I found interesting that I just kind of wanted to share before we jump into the disassembly is that there are basically three what you'd call bullseye marks, I guess, on the cylinder head that I'm pointing out here. That these three spots are kind of where you can gauge how much meat, if you will, is left on the cylinder head, how much it may have been shaved off. Again, this cylinder head should have never been removed after 210,000 miles. So these are basically, this is a head that was never shaved. And just for reference, when I measured those, I measured off the center of that bullseye circle, and it was about 1 millimeter of depth there for me. And again, please verify this on your own, but from a little bit of research that I've done and what I've seen online, it sounds like if you can still see, if it hasn't touched that bullseye portion, basically if that 0.08 was the service limit about how much you could take off. But again, if they don't kind of look similar to this, if they look a lot closer to flat and there's not as much, depth in there, that's kind of an easy tell. If you just happen to be looking at a used head, you might be able to really see if it's been surfaced multiple times already, or if maybe it's beyond its service limit. All right, so now we're going to jump into the teardown process. And the first thing, of course, we're going to do here is remove our valve cover and valve cover gasket. Most all those valve cover bolts are going to be a 10 millimeter. Next thing I'm going to do here is just pull off the thermostat housing. Now this has 4 bolts actually that hold it in place. I just didn't have one of the short ones in my hand here. But yeah, 2 long and 2 short. So next we're going to remove the cam position sensor, and not fully actually, because it's easier to remove this cam position sensor housing when you have that cap removed, that cam bearing cap. But we're going to take off the cover here first. Of course, just 3 bolts holding that on. Next, inside there is going to basically be that cam position sensor blade, if you will. Not sure what else you would necessarily call it. I think the owner's manual says cam position sensor support, but we're just going to take an impact and pop that out as well. Very unique bolt in there. Can't really confuse that one with anything else. I did make a camshaft install video if that's something you're looking for more directions on installing cams. I already have that on my channel as well if you want to reference that to install cams on your EVO. So next, I'm just going to show you guys what it looks like before the cams are actually removed. Again, a lot of this is covered in my camshaft install video, but worth pointing out here, you see these numbers on here. This one's at E5, E4. These are labeled. These cam caps are labeled. Need to go on the same spot they came off and basically be facing the same direction as well. So they really have to go on exactly where they came off, unless you did a lot of different machine work, but I'm definitely not going into that. So you just want to keep these organized, and realistically, this is just me documenting this for you. So hopefully if you have any confusion, you can come back to this and double check to see how this engine was laid out. You can see how the markings are. Most of the arrows face out. This stuff is also in the owner's manual, so you should be able to check that as well. But some of the arrows are a bit odd at the end, facing in, but also those end caps are a little bit easier to know where they go specifically, because they're not all the same. They're a bit more unique. So next, we're going to loosen up the bolts holding these camshafts in. You want to start from the outside, work your way in, loosen them up that way. Basically, you just don't want to have too much pressure on one side of the cam at a time. You don't want it to be bending too much, so you want to be careful with that. Also be mindful of the fact that you could still be having pressure, or the camshaft itself could still be putting pressure on the valves to be opening the valves underneath, basically in this situation, underneath the head here. So you don't want to do anything that could potentially bend the valves, so you don't want to have to really be like pushing down really hard on the cylinder head or anything. I probably could have had this tipped up in this case actually too, so there wasn't a chance that it would really push down and potentially, do any damage to the valves. So the next thing I decided to do here was pop off that actual housing. Now that I had that cam cap loose, I could pop off that cam position sensor housing and that cam position sensor as well. Just pulling that out, showing you what that looks like. Next, we're going to remove this HLA. A lot of people, whenever they hear HLA, they think Kigley. This is what the factory one looks like. This is what you could change to basically limit the oil that runs through your head. The Kigley one, from my understanding, would keep more oil down in your oil pan and in your short block in the lower half of your engine, and less to the head. But that's what the factory one looks like, and that's what I had removed. And again, according to the service manual, that piece is actually called the oil delivery body. So next, basically, once all the cam caps have been loosened up, some of them honestly were pretty tight. Again, I will probably say this multiple times, but there was a lot of miles on this thing before it was ever touched. So I chalked that up to why these were so tough to get off, but it definitely took a bit of convincing to get these cam caps off. But the good news was, once I took them off, I was kind of checking them over and inspecting them. As far as I could tell, there weren't any deep scoring, there wasn't any discoloring, anything like that, where it seemed like any extreme signs of wear. It just seemed like they hadn't been taken off in a long time, so it was a bit hard just to work them loose. So, like most things with this, you need to be patient, take your time, don't get upset, don't just, slam a screwdriver in there. You'll probably see that I am using basically a gasket scraper at some points, but I only did that once everything was up far enough where I could get it started. You don't really want to just use a screwdriver or gasket scraper right on the corners of something when it's still fully flat, because then you could just end up chipping away at it. So there we go. Now we have our other camshaft out of the way, and we can start pulling out basically the rocker arms and the lash adjusters, or lifters, as a lot of people like to call them. So a trick for this that I learned and just didn't really follow on this is that you could use an ice cube tray if you wanted to keep these all in order. If you're going to reuse everything, you can try to keep everything with the exact same, valve, spring, retainers, lifters, rocker. You could keep it with the exact same one, put it together the same way it came apart. I'm honestly not sure how super important that is, as far as if you were reusing all the same components. I think it's generally a suggestion to do it, but especially in my case, basically we ended up getting a lot of new components. I was getting brand new lash adjusters. All the valves were going to be reworked and resurfaced, put in new guides. So in my case, I didn't pay as much attention to where every particular rocker arm or lash adjuster came from. Again, a good area to do more research, something you can definitely double check yourself if you're digging into this. And now that the cams are out of the way, it's actually going to be easier to remove what's basically considered an upper timing belt cover, even though it's kind of, a lower portion compared to what most people think of as the upper cover that just covers the camshaft gears. This is the part that would kind of go, these two metal plates that go around kind of the sides and basically underneath the typical cam gear cover. So it's a little bit hard to see in the video, but there are just two bolts holding those covers on. These are relatively cheap, actually, honestly, and they're still currently available. So if you did want to buy brand new OEM ones, one is exactly the same. One side is exactly the same for the EVO 8, actually the EVO 4 through EVO 9, apparently. And the other side is a little bit different for the EVO 9. But I have put the OEM part numbers up on the screen and also a little bit of a visual so you can see the difference in the one that is not the same. So now I'm just showing again the intake ports, what those look like. This is the cylinder head side, of course, that's going to mate to your engine block, to the deck. This is before we pop out all the valves. And then the exhaust side. You can see how dirty the exhaust side is. Here's just a close-up shot of basically the top of the valve spring. These valve springs do kind of taper and get smaller as they get towards the top, so they will only reinstall one way. The retainers on top of these valve springs are super light. I believe they're actually made of aluminum, not titanium, but again, I did a little bit of research on that, and that's what I came up with from the forums, and that's what they showed me. I tried to just Google if they were made of titanium and didn't get a direct answer, but they're super light. So next, if you were going to take your head apart, you would need this special tool. This is one thing that's kind of a pain with these overhead cam engines. Sometimes it's very hard to get in to work on the springs and basically get into this portion of the head, with your hands. So they make a special tool for this where you can basically compress the valve spring, and then you end up pulling out the keepers or locks, however you want to call them. I like to utilize a magnet to help pull the locks out, just because it makes it a little bit easier to get in there to get them free. And basically once those locks or keepers are out of place, then you're just going to loosen up the tension on that spring, and that's going to let that spring be free. You'll be able to pull off that spring, that retainer, that bottom shim, as I like to call it, will be underneath there as well. And you're also going to potentially see basically the valve seal. You'll see that seal that's there as well. What is kind of nice about those seals is they hold the valves in place, so your valve isn't going to just drop out. If that seal wasn't there, your valve would be more likely to just kind of fall out, especially the way this head is angled to take apart. And here again with the spring, you can just see how it's tapered. And there you have it, all the components we just removed. So let the fun part begin. That was number 1 of 16. Now you get to do that 15 more times if you're doing this yourself. So again, cue the sped up footage, and we will repeat this process over and over and over again. And I don't have any real tips here other than the fact that I did end up putting this head back together myself, and while I'm thinking of it right now, what worked well for me to actually put these locks back on was basically to get one lock in place, usually spin it around, and then the lock, that is, spin it however it was oriented, put it the other way, because then I could usually sneak in that second lock, wherever that same first position was. Again, because it's a bit tight to get in there. Otherwise, sometimes you can utilize a screwdriver with a little bit of grease to help get those in as well. So here it is. The head is completely disassembled, basically from the point of view of where the valve cover would be. You're looking at everything torn apart. I still have the valve stem seals in there that need to be removed as well. And that is actually a pain. It's not very fun to pull the seals off. I don't know of any other way to do it other than using vice grip, and I think that's actually the way they show it to you in the owner's manual again, to just basically use a vice grip or pliers to take those off. But before we jump into that, we're just going to give you another spin around of the head, show you what it looks like with all those valves popped out. These are basically inside where you can see the guides. Each valve has a guide. The guide is basically where the valve itself would go and rides up and down, if you will. And in my case, with this specific head, I did end up actually replacing all the exhaust guides. They were out of spec, and I shouldn't just say because I didn't actually do it myself, but the guides were replaced with some GSC bronze guides. So here we go. Here's the struggle, the fun of removing these valve stem seals with the pliers. And also when it came to installing the new ones, it didn't seem to be that much fun to install the new ones either. From, again, a little bit of research I did, 7/16 socket is about the right size. You basically end up pounding these on a little bit, put a little grease on them, or a little assembly lube on them, I should say, before you put them on. But it's, I don't know, for me, I found it not to be the easiest thing to do. I guess with the right tools, it always makes your job a lot easier. They do make a specific special tool for you to install those seals that you could purchase as well if you were looking into this. And here we go, just a shot so you can see the actual guides themselves. You know, this guide on the left has that valve seal removed, and then the guide on the right, both those ones on the right, still have that seal on top. And just another shot of, you know, a bit more of the pieces as I took them out. You know, here's all of our valves, springs, retainers, and our cam caps as well. But that's really it. I mean, the head has been successfully disassembled. It's been taken apart, and it's ready to get serviced. It's ready to get machined. It's going to have to get some professional work done to it. So if you did want to inspect a few more things yourself, if you were disassembling your head, I definitely would check over your rocker arms. Basically, within this head, I determined that at least 2 of my rocker arms were kind of not usable. The one on the left here, you can see, is definitely scorn. It's got some damage basically where the tip of the valve would ride on that rocker arm. So I had 2 of them that looked like that, the one on the left. So those 2 are being replaced with new OEM ones. The problem here is, of course, I would replace all of them, but they are expensive by the time you add up the price for OEM rocker arms. Every one is like 30 or 40 bucks a piece. I don't know. If you did all of them, it would basically be $500 extra if you bought all new OEM rocker arms. So for most people, I believe they should be usable, reusable, but you definitely want to check them over and inspect them so something doesn't catch you, you know, off guard and really throw things off and end up costing you a lot more money in the long run. So do your best due diligence to inspect them, not only in making sure that the rollers will spin and making sure, you know, it doesn't sound like it has any odd noise or have any extra tolerance compared to any other one, especially if your head was working fine. I think that can be a good gauge. Obviously not the most scientific, but you can kind of gauge and make sure one is not specifically different than the other. And so one final thing I wanted to inspect when I was cleaning up these rocker arms is basically there's a little hole that oil should flow through for the lash adjuster where it sits and meets this rocker arm. What I did, a trick for this for me, is I kind of held it up to a flashlight and made sure I could see light through that hole, make sure they all looked pretty much similar as far as the amount of light that it looked through. Again, not super scientific, but if that was blocked off, I think that could certainly cause some issues. So when you are reusing some parts, I think it's best, of course, to inspect them as well as you can. So I double checked not only for excessive wear, but also just making sure there was kind of no blockage as well where the oiling would need to go through. So that's about it, guys. That is tearing apart an EVO 8 cylinder head. I hope you found this somewhat informative. Again, it bears repeating. I am not an expert in this area. I just like to document things I do, and I'm very grateful that I do have access to, you know, certain tools and other things that a lot of people don't have. So I'm trying to share that with you guys so you could not only be informed, but hopefully, you know, entertained, have a little fun with me along the way. A lot of you guys are very smart too. So again, as I mentioned earlier in the video, please check the comments for any other additional information, maybe something I missed, maybe something I did completely wrong. You know, check the comments, check the video description, you know, check your sources when you're doing anything. So, but that is about it for this video, guys. And as always, I certainly appreciate you watching. Feel free to reach out to me with any comments or questions in the, you know, comment section down below. Reach out to me in other social media accounts if you would rather use those as well. So this is Paul from Boosted Films, and thanks so much for watching.